Your phone is sitting on the table, face down. You put it that way on purpose, not because you're busy, but because even glancing at the screen, even the possibility of seeing those notification badges, creates something in your chest. A weight, quiet, but real. You know the messages are there, you've known for a while. Some of them have been waiting for days, maybe longer, and the longer they wait, the heavier they become. Not lighter, heavier. You tell yourself you'll answer later, when you feel more ready, when the words come more easily. But later becomes the next day, and the next day becomes the next week. And somewhere in that waiting, a second feeling arrives. Quieter than the first, but sharper. Guilt. Not loud, dramatic guilt. A low, persistent kind. The kind that hums in the background while you're doing other things, while you're making coffee, reading, trying to rest. It's just there. I haven't answered. Again, what is wrong with me? There are people for whom messages are effortless. They see a notification, they reply, they move on. Simple, automatic, weightless. For some people though, and maybe you're one of them, it doesn't work that way. For some people, every unread message is a small door, and opening that door means being present in a way that costs something real, something limited, something you're not always sure you have left by the end of the day. This video is for those people. For the ones who care deeply, but go quiet anyway. For the ones who aren't cold or indifferent, just depleted in ways that are genuinely hard to explain. Because what you're experiencing has a real psychology to it, a legitimate, traceable explanation. And that's exactly what we're going to explore. Slowly, without judgment. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't show up anywhere visible. It's not physical tiredness. It's not sadness exactly. It's something more like a depletion of interior resources. A sense that your reserves, emotional, cognitive, social, have been running low for a while. And in that state, even the smallest demands start to feel disproportionate to what you have available. A message from a friend doesn't feel small anymore. It feels like a door that might open into a long conversation, or an expectation you'll need to meet, or an emotional situation you'll need to hold carefully. And your system, already stretched, quietly resists, not out of coldness, out of self-preservation. For people with a sensitive nervous system, social interaction isn't just pleasant or unpleasant. It's metabolic. It uses something. It draws from a reserve that doesn't refill automatically overnight. Extroverts in general gain energy from contact. Conversation recharges them. Being around people fills something up. But for highly sensitive, introverted people, it works in reverse. Every interaction draws from that reserve. Every exchange, even a good one, costs something real. And when that reserve is low, even the lightest contact feels heavy. A simple, "How are you?" from someone you love can land like an obligation you don't know how to fulfill honestly. Because the honest answer isn't simple. It's somewhere between tired and okay, and something I don't have words for right now. And that answer feels too complicated, too much to give. So you say nothing at all. And the silence grows another day longer. Jung would say that introverted types, and highly sensitive people especially, are oriented primarily toward the inner world. Their primary reality is internal. Thought, feeling, image, impression, reflection. The outer world is real, but it is secondary. When the outer world makes too many demands, the inner world doesn't just get neglected, it suffers. And for these people, the inner world isn't a luxury or an escape. It's where they actually live. It's where they process, recover, and make sense of everything that happens to them. When social demands constantly interrupt that interior space, the person doesn't just feel tired. They feel invaded, like something essential is being taken without permission, like there's no room left to simply be themselves. And in that state, the mind begins to do something intelligent, even if it doesn't look that way from the outside. It starts to protect the last quiet corners it has left. It builds small walls. It delays. It goes silent. Not to be cruel, to survive. But here's the part that almost no one explains clearly. For sensitive people, a message is rarely just a message. It carries weight beyond the words themselves. It arrives with context, history, emotional tone, unspoken expectations. And your mind, before you've even decided how to feel, begins to process all of it. Not just the content, the person behind it, the relationship, the history between you. What this message might mean, what it might need, what it might open. What do they need right now? What's the right thing to say here? Will my answer disappoint them? Is there something underneath this I'm not seeing? Am I reading the tone correctly? You're not just reading words, you're reading a person. And that kind of reading takes something real out of you, every single time. There are people who can reply to 20 messages in 10 minutes without thinking twice. They write fast, send, move on. For you, a single message can sit in your mind for an hour before you know how to answer it honestly. Not because you're slow, not because you don't care, but because you feel the weight of communication in a way that others simply don't. You want to respond well, honestly, in a way that actually matches what the relationship deserves. And that intention, however kind it is, makes every reply feel like it requires something genuinely real from you. Now here's the part that turns exhaustion into suffering. It's the guilt. You don't just feel tired, you feel guilty for being tired. Ashamed of a limitation you never chose and can't easily explain. You see the notifications piling up, and instead of simply thinking, "I'll get to those later," your mind begins a quiet trial. I'm a terrible friend. These people deserve someone who actually shows up. Why can't I just answer a simple message? And this is where the psychology becomes especially important to understand, because the guilt doesn't make the messages easier to answer. It makes them harder. Now they're not just messages anymore. They're evidence. Evidence of your failure. Evidence of some fundamental inadequacy you've been quietly carrying. And when something becomes evidence of failure, the mind doesn't want to look at it. So the avoidance deepens, not out of laziness, but out of shame. More days pass, more guilt accumulates. And now the idea of responding feels even more impossible, because too much time has gone by. Because how do you even explain that? What do you say after a week of silence to someone who only asked how you were? This is the cycle, and many sensitive people know it more intimately than they'd like to admit. Exhaustion leads to silence. Silence leads to guilt. Guilt leads to more avoidance. And avoidance, eventually, leads back to more guilt. The loop closes, and closes again. I want to tell you about someone. I'll call him Daniel. Daniel was the kind of person others described as warm, thoughtful, genuinely present. When he was there, he was really there. He listened carefully. He remembered what people told him. He cared in a way that felt rare and real, but his phone was a source of constant low-level dread. Every morning he'd wake up and see the messages he hadn't answered from the night before. And instead of feeling ready to reply, he'd feel something closer to shame. So he'd put the phone down, tell himself he'd answer when he felt more ready. Later became the next day. The next day became the next week. And the longer he waited, the more impossible it felt to break the silence. Because now it wasn't just a message anymore. It was a conversation he'd have to explain himself in. Sorry I took so long. Things have been heavy. I don't really know how to explain it. And the thought of that explanation, the vulnerability it required, the awkward admission of having disappeared without a clear reason, felt more exhausting than the original message ever had. So he stayed quiet, and quietly hated himself for it. And the people he cared about most slowly stopped reaching out. What Daniel didn't understand, and what I didn't understand for a long time, in my own quieter version of this, is that his avoidance wasn't indifference. It was a nervous system asking for protection. It was an interior world defending its last remaining space. And the guilt, as painful as it was actually evidence of something important. It was proof that he cared, deeply, genuinely, more than most. People who truly don't care don't spend hours thinking about the messages they haven't sent. They don't lose sleep over the friendships quietly fading. The guilt itself, uncomfortable as it is a form of love in friction with exhaustion. And that distinction matters more than it might seem. Jung spoke about what he called the shadow, the parts of ourselves we reject, push away, and refuse to acknowledge in the daylight. For sensitive people who avoid messages, one of those shadow parts is often this quiet, difficult truth: that you need more solitude than the social world seems to allow, that you need long, uninterrupted stretches of silence to feel like yourself again. That contact, even loving contact, sometimes feels like a cost you can't always afford. And because the world around you seems to expect otherwise, you carry that need as something shameful, something broken, something to fix before anyone notices. But it isn't something to fix. It's something to understand, honestly, carefully, and with far more compassion than you've been giving yourself. If we go one layer deeper, something important appears. For many people who struggle with messages, the avoidance didn't begin with exhaustion alone. It started earlier, in experiences of being misunderstood, in conversations that felt like performances, where you had to say the right thing, manage someone else's feelings, navigate carefully around something fragile, in relationships where being reachable meant being responsible for someone else's emotional state, where answering a message wasn't just answering a message, it was accepting an invisible weight you hadn't agreed to carry. Over time, the nervous system learned something it couldn't unlearn easily. It learned that contact carries risk, that being available means being vulnerable to demands you didn't choose, that showing up fully, in conversation, in presence, in text, could cost more than you had to give. And so, it began to protect you, quietly, without asking permission, by making the messages feel heavy before you even opened them, by building hesitation into the reflex, by teaching your body to brace before your mind had a chance to decide. This isn't a malfunction. This is a form of intelligence, a kind of emotional self-preservation that developed in response to real experiences, real moments where contact led to depletion or disappointment, or the quiet grief of being misunderstood again. The problem is that it doesn't always distinguish between the conversations that would drain you and the ones that might genuinely restore something. It just learns. Contact is costly, silence is safe, and it applies that logic broadly, even to the people who would understand, even to the friendships that might actually nourish what's been running low. Now, some distinctions worth sitting with, because they can help you think more clearly about what's actually happening inside you. Avoiding messages because you're exhausted is not the same as not caring about the people who sent them. Needing time before you can respond is not the same as being unreliable as a person. It means you take communication seriously enough that you can't do it on empty. Protecting your inner space is not the same as being selfish. Selfishness takes from others. This is simply refusing to give what you genuinely don't have. These things feel identical from the inside, especially when the guilt is loud. But they are not the same thing, and knowing the difference changes how you carry it. Solitude is not abandonment. Needing quiet is not withdrawing love. And silence, even long silence, is not always a statement about how much someone matters to you. Sometimes it is simply the sound of a person doing their best to stay intact, to not give what they don't have, to wait until there's something real and honest to offer. There is also this distinction, which deserves careful attention. There's a version of message avoidance that is temporary and cyclical, linked to genuine depletion. It comes and goes. It responds to rest and silence. It lifts when the interior world has had enough space to breathe again. And then there's a version that has become a permanent wall, where the avoidance no longer tracks with exhaustion, where it's simply become a default, a way of keeping everyone at a safe distance, always, regardless of how you actually feel. That second version deserves honest attention, not judgment, but genuine curiosity. Because sometimes what begins as self-protection slowly becomes the very thing that deepens the loneliness you were trying to escape. So what can you actually do with all of this? Not to become a different person, not to force yourself into constant availability you don't have, but to live inside this reality without the crushing weight of guilt and without losing the few connections that genuinely matter to you. One thing that helps is lowering the standard you hold for the reply itself, not for the relationship, but for the message. You don't need to craft the perfect response. You don't need to address everything or match the full emotional weight of the original message. You don't need to be fully present to say something real. Sometimes a short, honest reply, sent imperfectly, without ceremony, is worth infinitely more than a perfect reply that never arrives. I've been quiet. I'm still here. I'm thinking of you. That is enough. Often, it is more than enough. Another thing that helps is learning to recognize your own rhythm honestly and making small decisions that respect it rather than fight it. You have a natural cycle of availability and depletion. There are times when you can be present, warm, genuinely engaged with another person. There are times when you genuinely cannot, and forcing presence in those moments produces something hollow that helps no one, including you. Learning to know the difference and honoring it without shame is not weakness. It's one of the more honest forms of self-knowledge available to you. If there are people in your life who feel genuinely safe, people who've shown they can hold you without pressure, without scorekeeping, it may be worth telling them simply that you sometimes go quiet. Not as an elaborate apology, not as a confession requiring explanation, just as honest, simple information. I care about you. I sometimes disappear. It isn't about you. Many people who truly matter will understand that more easily than you expect, and the ones who can't, that's information too. It's also worth creating small, low-pressure rituals around the moments when you do have energy. A time of day when you check in briefly with the people who matter most. Not a long conversation, not a performance of warmth, just a small, consistent signal that you're still there. A few words, a voice note, a short message sent without overthinking it. These small, regular signals carry an enormous amount of weight over time. They keep the thread alive even when you don't have much to offer. And they quietly, gradually, begin to dissolve the guilt because you're no longer disappearing completely. Seneca wrote in one of his letters that we should be deliberate about who we allow into our interior world. Not cruel, not cold, but intentional. The way a careful person tends a garden, knowing that not everything can grow in every season. He understood that solitude wasn't emptiness. It was the condition under which depth becomes possible. The quiet in which a person can finally hear themselves clearly. And he understood that a few real connections, tended honestly, imperfectly, but with genuine care, are worth more than many shallow ones maintained out of obligation or fear. You don't need to be available to everyone. You need to be present in the moments you actually can, to the few who truly matter. That isn't a lesser version of friendship. In many ways, it is a more honest one built on what's real rather than what's expected. The vision I want to leave you with isn't one where you've solved this, where you answer every message on time and never feel the weight of the inbox again. That's not a realistic picture, and honestly, it isn't even the right goal. The vision is quieter than that, more human, more yours. It's a version of you who understands why this is hard and stops treating exhaustion as a moral verdict about who you are, who keeps intentionally a small number of real connections, tended imperfectly but genuinely with whatever you have available, who communicates honestly with the people who matter, even when the words are few and arrive later than you'd like, who builds a life with enough silence that the moments of contact feel like a choice you're making, not a demand you're failing to meet. You are not a bad friend because you need more space than most people seem to. You are not cold because your nervous system asks for silence before it can speak. You are someone who feels things deeply, processes slowly and gives genuinely when you give. And that kind of giving, even when it arrives late, even when it's brief and imperfect, carries something real in it. Something that 100 quick replies from someone only half present could never hold. The guilt you carry is not proof of failure. It is proof that you care, more than you give yourself credit for. Let that be something. Let that be enough, for now, to begin. And if you've ever noticed that even when the silence has done its work, even when the exhaustion has lifted and there's space again, something still holds you back from reaching out first, from being the one who opens the door. That's a different layer of this. One that lives not just in exhaustion, but in something older and quieter. Something closer to the fear of being too much or not enough, or simply misunderstood again by someone you actually wanted to reach. That conversation continues in the next quiet chapter. Alone Together, a quiet corner of the internet for people who choose solitude over half-hearted connections.